friends, welcome to today's video. I'm going to break down the anatomy of this page, so to speak, this one on the right, and I'm going to recreate it for you and just kind of walk you through the steps on how you can create something really similar. So, I've got a journal here. This is a watercolor journal. This is the Jane Davenport one in the small size. I'm just going to work on this side of the page, and the things you're going to need are some painter's tape. If you don't have this, you could use washi tape. This is by 3M and it's kind of a low tack adhesive tape. But if you use something a little stronger, if you've got a heat tool, it'll be easy to peel off. But we just want something to mask off our border. I'm going to use one of these stamps today from my stamp set, She's Three-Faced. This isn't actually available in the Etsy store right now. I do not know when I'm going to restock this one, so please use an alternative if you have one. Alternatively, you could use a kind of like a cutout piece of ephemera, a little drawing or something that you have lying around, or you could just draw something freehand, but I like to skip a step and add one of these faces in. Since I'm using the stamp, I'm going to use an acrylic block as well and some VersaFine ink in Toffee. This is a waterproof ink, and I'm using the color Toffee so that I can use it more as a guide, a blueprint for what I want to sketch, and not actually have it be super visible in the end. I've got some watercolors here. I don't know which set I'm going to end up using, but I just wanted to show you some in the video. So I'm going to use some watercolors to color the whole thing in, and then just some assorted pens and pencils, etc. But I'm pretty sure that's all we're going to need for now, so let's get going. The first thing you want to do is mask off the border of your page. So I'm going to use this blue painter's tape and just go all around the edge. You don't have to go right to the edge, but I do like to go close so that I can kind of line up that tape with the side of the page. That'll mean that I get like a really nice straight kind of frame going on. One tip for this painter's tape is make sure you really do press it in around the edges, because even though it says edge lock, it won't really lock in anything unless you push it down. So I've learned that the hard way. Now you can see we're left with this area framed off. I'm going to put my stamp on my block, ink it up a little bit. I'm going to stamp it around a bunch of times. I kind of want to stamp it coming off the side as well, so it'll kind of be leaving this area a little bit. In the end, we're actually only going to pick up one face. The rest is just kind of to have this texture in the background. You might not have even noticed it in the original example I showed you, but there are little faces floating around the background. Now that they're all stamped out, I'm going to take my Pilot OPT mechanical pencil and I'm going to choose the face that I want to work with. I want this middle one here because I kind of want to put the body coming all the way down to the bottom. I'm going to sketch in just a very generic kind of body shape that I would typically draw. She's going to be a mermaid, so I don't really have to put in a lot of details at the bottom. Like I don't have to put legs in or anything, just kind of have her hips widen off to the edge of the masking tape. And a tip I like to use when I don't want to draw hands or bother with any of that is just have the hands just disappear behind her hips. I also want to take her hair and extend it up to the edge of the page. So I'm going to keep it quite tight around the ear area and then kind of fan it out at the top. And just take it all the way up to the masking tape there. So you can see we've kind of got this figure emerging. Now I'm just going to quickly render it, kind of color it in, just really haphazardly. To be honest, I like to keep a really simple color scheme for these things, because I think it's less about the rendering and more about the visual appeal of it kind of extending beyond the frame. So I just kind of want to go in with a few colors that are nice complements for each other. Some oranges and pinks and whatever. I think you can be as experimental as you want with this, because in mixed media we have the luxury of coming back over the top of it with all our other mediums to kind of give it more depth. But for this, you kind of just want to lay down some color really, really loose. The thing I love about watercolor is actually using a lot of water to get those nice pools and blossoms and blooms. Might even add in a deeper color here, nice rich color, just see what that does. I don't even mind going over her face, because like I said, we'll come in with some mixed media once it's dry and kind of deepen up her. So this is more about the background and kind of getting that a nice loose and modeled effect. I think my ultimate tip for when you're doing stuff like this is just don't be shy about it. Really pack on the pigment, really throw the water on there. You'll be surprised at how much you can get away with if you just sell it with confidence. I'm gonna give it a bit of a dry. Now, before I go any further, I just want to point out something that I get asked questions about sometimes, and it's the effects of watercolor and how to get certain ones. Now, there are a few varying factors that kind of go into it. The paper is probably the most important one, and then you want to look at the watercolors themselves. I use a mixture of handmade watercolors, store-bought watercolors, like anything I can kind of get my hands on that's a beautiful color. I'll try. So some watercolors are going to have a lot more of a granulating effect, and the two that I use today really don't. They're actually quite flat in their application. So if you really want to get all that texture, you're gonna have to put a lot of water on there and kind of let it air dry. You saw that I used the heat tool here, and when you use the heat tool, it kind of pushes that pigment through the damp paper, and it's going to have a lot softer of a blend as it dries quicker. If you let it puddle and pool and kind of air dry, over time, parts of the paper are gonna dry much quicker than other parts, and you'll start to see a lot of that separating pigment. So those are some factors that will affect it, but ultimately the paper, I want to show you the original example. You can see here, there's a lot of water puddling and pooling, and you can see all these really fantastic, watercolor effects kind of showing up much clearer on this as opposed to this. And that's mainly because this paper is just different. It's lighter, thinner. The coating on this paper, this is not a watercolor paper. It's actually not that receptive to water. So it's going to hold a lot more of that water and pigment on the top and not seep in as much. So as the water dries in these kind of puddles, you're going to see a lot more of that separation because it's not truly going to feather and bleed out, say, as much as it would on a watercolor paper. So even the purple pink color that I used is the same one on here, and you can see how different the effect is just by using a different technique. So I'm going to go over this again because I do want a lot more texture in it, and I possibly might leave this to dry, air dry for this next one. So I'm not going to try and add too much because I don't want to be here forever. And then to add some of that texture in, I'm actually going to use a little paper towel and kind of blot up some of the pigment as it's drying. And I'm going to go in with less water this time because I want the color to be a little bit more saturated. I want to have an opportunity to kind of blot some of it out. It's still going to be a bit of a different effect than what you saw on the original. So if you do find yourself collecting a bunch of journals and paper types, just give this technique a go on a few different ones using a few different techniques like air drying, using the heat tool, use some of your granulating pigments, and then use some of your more really flat wash kind of a watercolor that you might gravitate towards. And also obviously just try it on different papers. So here's where I would kind of scrunch up the paper, and there's all these ridges to the paper now, so it's actually going to give me a bit of a kind of a haphazard model kind of a look. And this is where you can force in some of those effects on papers that aren't necessarily that receptive to it. It's never going to be completely the same. I don't think the point is to try and replicate the effects of watercolor on watercolor paper the same way you would get it on the Midori paper, but I think it's all part and parcel of the fun of experimenting to see what you can come up with. Alternatively, you can drop puddles of water onto it as well, then you can start to see the pigments separate. That's also a really effective technique to get some blossoms and blooms in there. So I'm going to let this one air dry so that the pigment's a little more saturated and so that I can kind of keep some of this texture going on. Psych, just kidding. It's been air drying for a little bit now, but I wanted to use this opportunity while it was kind of, in between wet and dry to kind of flick some more of this pigment on. It's going to give even more texture, and where it's still wet, it will feather out, and where it's dry, it will kind of keep this little, these little flicks of color. You know, sometimes I can get carried away and just do too much. This might be one of those times, who knows? But sometimes I think when people are asking, how come it didn't get to this point, or I did everything you did, I don't know, there's something missing. Sometimes I just think it's just about layering, and with watercolor it's a little tempting to not layer it because you're going to start reactivating some of the pigment underneath if you start adding water again. So my tip to try and combat that, even though it's not going to be perfect, is that use less water the more layers you do. So your last kind of layers are going to be a bit more of a dry application, whether it's flicking some paint on there, or even when you saw like a lot less water going on the second layer. I think having less water content on there is probably going to try and preserve some of that original layer. You know, also you could just keep relayering over it. I think that's also the beauty of watercolor, is if you've gone too far, you can just put some water back over the top and kind of, you know, erase a layer, so to speak. So I'm just going to let this air dry now, and then I'm going to keep going. Alright, so that was almost completely air dried, and then I just kind of blasted it with the heat tool at the end. I'm going to pick some pencils out now to kind of just deepen up some of the colors on my little lady in here. Some colors that are already down, so I want my oranges, my purples, maybe some pinks, maybe even some red, who knows. Let's just get carried away with these. I'm going to use this blue pencil now just to kind of outline all the things I want to outline, because I think it's a little lost at this point. In the original, I did go over this with a ballpoint pen, but I've used a lot of pencil, and I think the ballpoint pen might have a difficult time trying to go through that. But I think this pencil will be nice too. And I just want to use a color because I think introducing black at this point might just be a little too harsh, a little bit too stark of a contrast. And I love a good Mitsubishi red-blue pencil. When you're doing this outlining process, don't be afraid to kind of change the structure as well. So if there's a line that you think you might want to sharpen up, or maybe you've cut in too close, or you can see a few construction lines underneath that you might want to clean up, I think this is a good time to do that. And I'll always encourage you to kind of go really bold with it. Strong and wrong is better than thinking, oh, what if I had done that? I might also darken up some of this shading with the blue as well, just to keep that color kind of flowing through the piece. Got a team with the theme. Oh, she needs eyebrows too. I don't want her to be really nudie, but I also don't really want to put clothes on her, so I don't know what I'm going to do here. Yeah, I might just draw a band over the top. Why do I feel like that made it look even more suggestive? Maybe she needs a bit more. Oh, do you know what? I think I'm just going to give it straps or something. So a bit more detail than I planned on adding, but you kind of just go with the flow with these things. There's really nothing specific to achieve. Just trying to have a good time. Who am I talking to? I'm literally here by myself in this room talking like an absolute lunatic. I hope you're enjoying that. Alright, so the blue has given like a lot of contrast there, but I'm planning on putting the blue extending out of the frame as well, so I'm just a little unsure about how I want to deepen up some of this part here. I'm going to add some white Universal Signo gel pen to the eyes, just to pop them out a bit, and perhaps if I add this white gel pen around the rest of it, it will give me some more contrast, and my eyes won't be tempted to look around the image, just at it. So we'll pop some in her eyes, we'll pop some on her nose, even on her face a little bit, up by her brow bone. She's got that highlight pop in. She's glistening under the sea. Some on her lips, give her that gloss life. Wow, I mean, she's got it everywhere. Some on her shoulders. She's bathed in highlight. Yeah, I don't know. I still don't think the contrast is great between the background and her, so let's just be bold and put some of this deep purple. Oh. I don't know what color that mixed with, but it looks a little muddy. Whoops. It's fine. We'll live. I'm just going to put some of it around the edge. You know what, it's not exactly the same effect as we had on the other page, but I'm not hating it. So let me just blot some of this texture out as well. Just wanted to saturate the back a little bit more than it was. Alright, I just gave you a great example of what not to do. Remember how I said try not to add more water on top of your layers? I went ham with the water, and now you can see I've washed away a lot of that texture that I kind of created before. So, not the end of the world. I am actually going to redo this in the other journal with the Midori paper, because I do want to show you a much more simplified version than I've tried to, you know, muddy up here. But let's keep going, because I don't think it's an absolute fail. It's just not... It's not the original intention for the piece. I'm just going to remove all of this blue painter's tape. If you find that the tape you're using is too difficult to remove, or you're ripping your paper, then just heat it with a heat tool. or a hairdryer if you have it. I used to use a hairdryer, it's just too much wind. And it will soften up the adhesive on the tape, make it a lot easier to peel off. Stunning. Right, now that she's come out of her frame, we're going to take the hair and the tail and just extend them to the edge of the page. And don't be afraid to kind of take up a lot of space with this. You could have the tail coming back up onto another page, but I'm not going to do that for you today. Then I'm going to take a color, just paint the area that I'm seeing up here. I'm going to try and build in this texture on the first layer that I'm doing. So as I put the pigment down, I'm keeping the page a little bit saturated, but not a lot. It's not like fully got tons of water on it, but there's enough to saturate it. And then I'm going to try and move that pigment around and just put little tiny drops of clean water in it, just to get the pigment activated. Even dropping some more of the pigment straight into that damp surface. Just kind of randomly, just to let it all flow around. I might even dab some of it up here because it's a little wet. I think the better I work the effects in now, I could use this really granulating pigment here too. The better I work the effects in now, the less tempted I'll be to go in and destroy it afterwards. I won't feel the need. So while the paper's damp, things are still going to kind of feather out and bleed into each other. And you'll just want to alternate between dabbing kind of concentrated pigment into that damp area, but also some fresh water dots. So you just rinse off your brush and kind of dab a little bit of water in there. Wherever you see some of those concentrated pigments, and that's where you're more likely to get some of that really effective blooming. Some people really don't like that. Some people just really love a flat wash. I'm partial to both, so I like to enjoy all of it. I'm gonna let that air dry, and then she's pretty much done. So I'll get set up for the next one. This notebook I have here is a Midori paper notebook. This is the 10th anniversary edition, and this has the kind of the sketch like log. You kind of write your date and your little thing up here. I do some urban sketching in here and just some little doodles. So I'm going to demonstrate exactly what we did just over there, and I'm going to put it in this book just to show you how much easier it is if you're working with a paper that can give you the effects that you want without really having to work at it. I'm going to use the same stamp, but this time I'm going to second generation stamp it. So I'm going to stamp once off to the side onto a scrap piece of paper, and then I'm going to lightly stamp on here. So I just want a lighter effect. You could just use a lighter ink pad, but I only have a few of these ink pads, so I just kind of make do. I'm going to keep this one a lot simpler by only using 2 colors. So I've got my designs by Rachel Beth here. This time I'm going to use the teal. Oh, I didn't draw in my body. Hang on. I got carried away. I'm going to use this color Eno pencil for this one. I just want a really light sketch. Give her body a bit more of a dynamic angle. So you can already see on this paper, oh, I'm making a mess. The paper itself is going to buckle because it's a lot thinner, and anywhere it kind of buckles, it's going to pull that pigment into those little valleys, and that's where I mean it's going to dry in that kind of an effect, and as it dries over time, you'll start to see how all of it separates a lot easier than trying to recreate that on a watercolor paper that is kind of made for you to be able to blend it out smoother and easier. Some people hate the buckling, but I think it gives such a lovely texture, especially when you're flicking through the book. I wouldn't want every page to have buckling all over it, but if you do heat this with a heat tool, you can actually kind of stretch it out back to flat. Might need a couple of layers for this one. You can see how with this paper it doesn't dry the same way at all, and even if you pick up some of that pigment, you're only going to pick it up from the center of those puddles. That's why I just think it's such a great thing to experiment with different papers just to see what you can get out of it. I know that there are rules about what you use and where, and you know, it's not great to have buckling and everything, but I don't really care that much. I care sometimes. If there's something really specific that I want to achieve, I care. Obviously, because I'm redoing the, you know, this tutorial in this book just to show you the difference. But for the most part, I don't think you should concern yourself with a lot of rules. I also think the great thing about having all this texture is that it just kind of eliminates the need to have a second color. You don't really need the extra interest because it's already so interesting to look at. Now I'm going to try and stretch the paper just by pulling on it a little bit to create some tension and kind of flatten it out as I heat tool it. You can see it's not super flat, it's still warped a little bit, but if you try and see the texture on the back, it's not as crinkly as what it would be if you just kind of left it. So I'm enjoying that. Now I'm going to grab a teal colored pencil and do all of my shading with that. That one turned out much better than the last one. I don't think the other one's bad. I can see it, it's dried now. I'll pull it over for a second, hang on. So you can just see the effects are really, really different. And I think you're gonna bring your mixed media into it and try and add something to this to try and make it look like that, when in fact this should just be its own thing and this should have been its own thing. But you know, these are learning experiences. I'm kind of glad that I got to show you how different the effects can turn out on different papers. That wasn't what I was planning on showing you, but I think it's always good to have like an actual real life example happen before your eyes. But it's not to say the other one's not bad, it's just, you know, for this I think the effective look really came down to how the paper reacted with that watercolor. And it's just something about this, you know, this Midori MD paper notebook that really does it for me. There are other papers that will do this as well. I can't speak to all of them because I haven't tried every single one of them. But I just encourage you to try. You'll know pretty quickly when you put your watercolor on there and it's dried, if it starts to make these kind of patterns that look like, you know, topography, when you kind of slice the layers of the earth. Is that what it is? I'm talking about geography now. I have no idea what I'm talking about. You'll start to see if it dries with that kind of cross-sectional layering of all those pigments. I think that'll be the most effective paper for you to use for this specific technique. But I do encourage you to try anything that you might have and then share what works for you and the different effects that you can create. Again, I'm gonna take the hair off the page, and this tail's on a bit more of an angle, so I'm just going to slant it down this way and color those in with the pinks this time. Yes, I'm single, oh, we want to mingle, and my friends are on the way. You got that good vibe. Alrighty, now that is it. That's the end result. I know it was a bit of a struggle to get there. I'm glad you took the learning journey with me. From left to right, the original that we based this off of, you can see that this is watercolor. If you can really glance, you can see the little heads back there. I've done the watercolor with the white gel pen and also a just a regular ballpoint pen, like a Muji gel pen, and that's how I kind of outlined everything. And in this example, I did use that really dark purple color and then kind of shaded the skin with the orange. Now, perhaps that's where I got the idea to put the orange in with the purple on this. And I think having so many colors and so much water on there, and especially working on a different paper, I was really trying to force the same effects that I was getting here, which I think you can see at step 2, I kind of had the effects there, but because the color vibrancy wasn't what I wanted, I washed over it and ended up ruining all of that. So a really good real life example of me not following the instructions that I set out, but I think it was a good thing to see nonetheless. It's not a bad result. I still think this is good and worthwhile, but for me, I really wanted to show you all the texture and how simple it was to create something so effective. And so then we went back to the Midori paper journal, where I think you can see it was a lot easier to get all of this texture. We only used one watercolor in here, one watercolor up there, and it all just came down to a teal pencil and this Mitsubishi blue red pencil, again with some of that white Uniball Signo just to pop some highlights out, and then you're free to journal around it, put your quotes around it, write your shopping list around it. I don't know what you do in your journals, but I'm sure it'd look lovely around. And that's it. That's the anatomy of this page and how it came together. Let me know if that's something you are interested in, some of the other pages and how they come together. I think it's a lot more fun to kind of look at techniques and end up creating with them rather than just breaking them down and looking at how they work. Hopefully this has been something that's been easy enough to follow along, even with the little mishaps we had on this one. But if it is something you're interested in, let me know, and also pop over to Instagram and put a little comment on any of the journal pages that you are curious about how they came together, and perhaps I'll look at the comments over there and pick from those lists some of the pages that we look to deconstruct and put back together. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it. That's it for today. Until next time, thanks for watching. Bye.